Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is round number 14 of the rapid tie-break, rapid game number 2 of 4. And in this game, Anand has the white pieces, that first game of the rapid match being a draw. Anand in this game kicks off with e4. And now after Gelfand c5, we're entering after knight f3, knight c6. Once again, the Rossolimo variation of the Sicilian. After e6, well, and keep in mind we have seen this a couple times already in the match. Bishop takes, b takes, b3. We've seen different orders. We've seen b3 first in the match. We've seen d3 and then b3. Apparently Anand has something prepared here. Let's see what it is. Knight takes e5, queen e7, now d4. Previous match we saw bishop to b2, but d4 is a great change in the position, a great change in the structure. After now d6, knight takes c, queen takes e, the queen must block, being the knight being hit on c6. The queens come off, and a very lively position still, where both sides really do need to be cautious of the king position. So the knight runs to the side, the bishop picks off that pawn, splitting these guys up. That term that I really like to describe that center pawn in a group of 3, the heart of the position, I think is a very good one to maybe have in your own vocabulary as your just your internal dialogue, I should say, just because it really makes a lot of sense. You know, without the heart, things become weak, right? And that's what we have right now. We have 2 isolated pawns for white. Black having the bishop pair, but struggling to get some more development in. The bishop does decide on h3, and Anand captures on c5, the immediate recapture. And now more development on the white side. Black deciding to castle. There were interesting possibilities here during the live stream on Twitch, twitch.tv/ChessNetwork. I was considering something like the knight maybe trying to get to this f5 square to watch over the pawn. I think I was also relying upon, in many instances, the computer evaluation, and I think it was castles, knight e7, as well as knight to f6 as being a possibility. But the move chosen was queenside castle, and now after bishop f4, starts to become a bit awkward here. A lot of squares being controlled around this black king. The knight has one of them, the bishop has the other 2, d7 now being the only safe square for that black king beyond the square he's sitting on, c8. So anyhow, that is now addressed. Bishop d6, getting rid of one of the guys that's out to take away the squares from the black king. We do have the bishops come off, and now we have rook to g5, and many in the Twitch chat at this point were calling out for just rook takes on g7. To be honest, I really don't know why that wasn't played. Rook g5 does have its purposes, though. Maybe it is best to just grab this pawn with check, and in doing so, you are creating a passed c pawn. If you're grabbing the pawn on g7, you're not allowing any of your pawns to become passed. So maybe it is better to just go with rook g5, get this pawn with check, and then the c pawn could play a role later on. Anyhow, on the black side, not really much that can be done about the loss of the c pawn with check. That's what does happen. King b8 as the reaction, and now knight c4, hitting that rook. No reaction just yet. It's rook on rook to e8, giving a check. The knight is there to defend, but there is pressure still. h2 is maybe a possibility, but you know what? That's not really working, I don't think, because, and I think the line that I was showing during the stream was something like if the knight plays here, there might just be, let's make the move first. After knight d5, if the knight's grabbing on h2, I think after something like f3, the knight is running short on squares. Not 100% on that. But anyhow, he kind of struggles to get back into play, I think, if he grabs on h2. It was not played. Instead, we do have knight takes knight. The knight recaptures. The bishop gives a check, and we have f3. Note that if the king is going elsewhere, I think there are several instances where the bishop can be quite annoying if it's allowed to sit on this f3 square. So f3 says, no, I will not allow you to get to f3. The bishop comes back, and we really see a case where the bishop really does well against the knight. I think a strong case for how a bishop can turn out to be better than a knight type of a position. So it comes back to c8, not really with the intention to play to c6, or a6, excuse me, because of c4, and it's just kind of shut down along that diagonal. But there is this bishop b7 to h1 diagonal. So rook to e1, white is trying to just work out of this pin on the knight. And now, after rook h6, rook h1, a sad move to have to make. Keep in mind, white is up a pawn, but it's black that has a lot of pressure. There's no longer an issue. I'm not sure there was a big issue for black. It looked a little bit menacing, having a bishop on f4 earlier and a knight on a5 controlling squares around that black king, but that's not the case right now. So instead, after rook h1 was played, now the rooks are trained on the knight. It's defended now with the only move, rook to c3, and now f5. Looking to exploit that pin with f4. The king gets out of it. The pawn presses forward, hits the knight, allows for rook e2 moves, and fixes this pawn on f3, which the bishop can maybe be targeting later on. Knight e5, it's central, but it's accessible. Bishop b7s, rook pins. Black decides to press forward, defend on f4, and there's possibilities for maybe h5, g4. Or, better yet, just something like g4. And then the f-pawn, before you know it, becomes passed. The reaction, defend the knight first. Allow this check, really can't avoid that. The king runs to probably the safest sector of the board, where there's a group of 3 healthy pawns, b2 being a nice home eventually. And now we have rook f2. Look at the activity for black. White, again, is up a pawn, but rook activity. 1 pig on the second, looking for another one soon thereafter on e2. h4, looking to get that h file open. c2 is now hit twice. It's defended with rook c3. A completely, well, I was going to say completely defensive duty, but really not so much. I mean, it is contributing in some way to shouldering off this king from maybe getting active, and it's serving a good role. Watching over c2, watching over f3, and the h file again can open up. And knowing this, black takes steps to avoid the h file from opening up. First, hitting the knight, indirectly the pawn on f3. The rook comes over to defend, and now we have g takes h4, knight takes f4, hitting the rook. The rook comes back, avoiding that. There's no way to maintain the rooks on the second rank at that point. The rook comes over, this right here being now a #1 priority for white. Get rid of this passed pawn. Rook c8, pair of rooks come off, bishop recapturing, rook takes h, bishop f5 now converging on c2, rook h5 hitting the bishop, bishop takes c2, rook gives a check, the king runs to the corner, and now after knight d5, a mate in 1 threat on c7 is there. That is met with now a6, providing a flight square for the king on a7. The rook comes over, applying pressure to a6. There is no king, rook takes pawn here. It's tethered to the bishop right now, so we now have king b7 defending that a pawn. The knight b4 move, hitting both the pawn and bishop. The bishop does back up. After knight takes pawn, rook takes pawn. We have a 2-0 majority on this side, and a passed rook pawn, which the knight hates to have to track down. Very difficult to stop a passed rook pawn for a knight. Or excuse me, the knight hates to have to defend against a passed rook pawn. So anyhow, we have knight c5 with check, king b6, the pawn pushes up 1, defending everything. Rook hits the pawn. Everything is just glued together right here. Everything is very well coordinated. The bishop is not going to be any bother to any of these white pieces. Rook g4, the king is getting involved. The pawn is getting pushed. The knight lands a check. Another, well, not another fork, but the knight gives a fork. The king is making inroads here, looking to eventually escort these pawns. The bishop comes back to e8. Keep in mind that in many of these games, and this game in particular, Gelfand is very low on time, and it's very easy to slip up. Very difficult to defend, even though you do have that 10-second increment. That's not much. So the pawn presses forward. The rook is getting ready to be in a position to get behind it, hitting the bishop as well. The knight gives it another fork right here. Rook sidesteps that with check. The bishop comes to c2 and prevents this a-pawn push. You really want to prevent both pawns from rolling, and being on c2 does prevent that a4 advance. Rook comes over behind the passed pawn. Rook grabs a, rook takes on h4, and we're entering drawn land, because there's always the possibility for, let's say, the bishop giving itself up for this pawn, and then trying to defend king rook versus king rook and knight. We're not quite there yet, however. After rook g3, just something to be aware of, that, you know, just getting into position to sack the bishop for the pawn. We do have knight d5, rook g5, the pawn pushes, bishop comes back to f5, rook h6, bishop's moving. A lot of, I think a lot of this was, at least on Gelfand's part, just trying to move instinctually, making logical moves, trying to gain some time on the clock. Again, these being rapid games. Not the easiest thing to do. King a7, rook g6, the bishop to f3, rook gives a check. After king to b8, the knight's coming back. It defends the pawn, meets the threat. The bishop and rook were converging on that knight on d5. The bishop comes back, basically just trying to stay on this diagonal, keeping it in a position to watch out for the pawn pressing forward anymore. And well, let's see how this finishes up. King c4, bishop f3. King is now sneaking around what I thought was going to be eventually getting to this a5 square. Bishop d5, knight a4. Challenging the rook. If the rooks are exchanged, I believe it turns out to be a very easy draw, so that's sidestepped. Rook g5, bishop f3, and again, keep in mind, if you're the side that does have a time advantage, it makes sense to want to keep more pieces on the board. There's more complications. It's white that's trying to win here. So knight c5, king c7, rook g6 is now preparing to play b6 with check. King a5, rook f5, knight gives a check, the king bumps over. Now we have a fork here, and we have the capture, knight for bishop. Is this a won position or a lost position? After rook b3, we have rook check, king d7, rook to b8, and Gelfand resigns. Initially I thought it was a loss on time or something like that, because he was just getting so low, but it was in fact resignation. There's not really a whole lot to do. Something that I initially fumbled with, I thought, what is the continuation exactly? But we eventually arrive at Lucena position, where after, let's say, and by the way, I can't really move the pieces, so that's kind of why I'm relying upon my mouse. So there's a little bit of a mental calculation needed. But if, let's say, the rook makes a waiting move to b2, we could have king a7, and if there's king to c7, you just play b6. You're giving check. You're defending the rook. That's the main thing, and this is something that for some reason I overlooked when I was doing the stream. King a7, king c6 is met with pawn to b6. If king c6, then you give a check and you march your pawn forward. But this didn't happen. It just got to the point of rook b8, and Gelfand ends up resigning. There's not really, again, running with, let's say, rook b2, king a7. If the rook gives a check, the king comes over to b7, the rook comes over to the b file, the pawn makes more progress here, just playing to b6, and it's a one king, rook, and pawn position, something to certainly be familiar with in these type of endgames. But anyhow, this is one where we did have a decisive result in this game 2, in this round 2 of 4 rapid games, and we are at this point with 1.5 points for Anand to Gelfand's half point. And we'll see what happens in round 3, in rapid game number 3 of 4. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care.